In the heart of Bundu, a place many in the city preferred to ignore, life moved at a pace shaped by survival rather than hope. Bundu was not the kind of neighborhood anyone wished to be born into. Its streets were narrow, its air heavy with the smell of smoke and stagnant water. When it rained, and it rained often, streams of dirty water ran freely through the poorly dug gutters, spilling into the homes of those who lived too close to the ground. The roofs, patched with rusted zinc sheets and old tarpaulins, offered little protection. Families slept with bowls and buckets carefully positioned to catch the steady drip of rainwater leaking through the ceiling. It was in this forgotten corner of the city that a young man lived with two of his closest friends. They were not brothers by blood, but hardship had bound them together more tightly than blood could. Each day, they rose before the sun, carrying sacks of roasted groundnuts to the market. That was their business, their only means of survival. The little they earned was barely enough for food, let alone comfort. By nightfall, whatever coins they had made went into buying kerosene for the lantern, or food that was hardly enough to satisfy their hunger. Their home was not a home in the true sense of the word. It was a single, dark room at the end of a crooked footpath, its walls soaked with dampness, the floor sometimes turning into mud whenever the rains lasted longer than a night. The three men slept side by side on a wooden bed frame that groaned under their weight, the thin mattress doing little to ease the hardness of life. When it rained, the room transformed into a battlefield, water seeping in from the ground, dripping relentlessly from above. Many nights were spent awake, pushing water out with broken plastic bowls and rags, praying the rain would stop before it drowned them in their sleep. The man, the central figure of the story, had learned early that life had no patience for the weak. Poverty had carved lines into his face, making him appear older than he truly was. Though young, his eyes carried the heaviness of someone who had fought too many silent battles. He was not unkind by nature, but hunger and struggle had taught him to focus on survival rather than sentiment. In Bundu, dreams were luxuries, too expensive for the poor. Men thought not of what they wanted to become, but of how they would make it to the next day. For this man and his friends, the market was their battlefield, and groundnuts their only weapon against hunger. Yet, despite the hopelessness around them, life had a way of surprising even those who had given up on hope. For in the midst of the hardship, in this corner of Bundu where poverty seemed permanent, destiny was quietly weaving a story, one that would test the limits of love, endurance, betrayal, and forgiveness. The man had no idea that soon, his life would change forever, not because he struck gold or found a way out of Bundu, but because of a woman, a tailor whose path was about to cross his in the most unexpected way. Life in Bundu was hard, but sometimes, fate had a way of bringing light into even the darkest corners. That light came the day he met her. She was a tailor, skilled with her hands, graceful in her movements, and always carrying herself with quiet dignity despite her humble circumstances. 4 years, she had worked diligently for a wealthy family in the city. They trusted her with their clothes, admired her neat stitches, and even spoke proudly of her talent. But wealth has a way of moving, and when the family decided to relocate abroad, she had no choice but to uproot her life too. It was during that uncertain transition that her path crossed with his. At first, it was nothing extraordinary, just a meeting between two struggling souls in a world that rarely showed mercy. She was looking for a place to belong, and he, though poor, was drawn to her quiet strength. They began as friends, talking in the evenings about small things, about the market, about tailoring, about the future neither of them could clearly see. She admired his resilience. He admired her kindness. Their bond, though fragile at first, began to grow stronger with each passing day. For her, he was not just another man in Bundu. He was someone who understood what it meant to struggle. And for him, she was a rare presence. A woman who could listen, laugh, and still believe in tomorrow even when today offered no reason to. But when the wealthy family finally left, her world shook. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. In Bundu, a woman alone was vulnerable to hunger, gossip, and despair. That was when he stepped forward. Perhaps it was compassion, perhaps something deeper, but he opened his door and offered her shelter. At first, it was awkward. His friends, who had shared the little room with him for so long, looked at him with surprise. But he assured them that things would change, that he would soon bring his own partner into his life. True to his words, his friends eventually found their own place, leaving him and the woman to begin their life together. For her, moving in with him was a leap of faith. She left behind not just her tailoring but also the stability she once had with her employers. She told herself love was worth the sacrifice, that one day, things would be better. She believed in him. She believed in them. The first days were filled with cautious hope. He was not the most affectionate man, but there were moments, small, fleeting gestures, that gave her something to hold on to. A smile, a brief touch, a word of encouragement. To her, they were promises of a brighter tomorrow. She cooked with what little they had, cleaned the room tirelessly, and dreamed of a future where her sacrifices would bloom into happiness. She was hopeful. He was distant. But love, at that stage, was enough to keep her going. Neither of them could have guessed how quickly that love would be tested. The first months of their life together were filled with a fragile kind of hope. She had walked away from her sewing machine, from the sound of cloth being cut and stitched under her fingers, from the joy of creating beauty out of plain fabric. Tailoring had been more than a job for her. It was her pride, her gift, her means of survival. But for love, she let it go. She believed that by standing beside him, by supporting him, by sharing in his poverty, she was building a foundation for a better tomorrow. She told herself that one day, when things improved, she would return to her craft. But for now, she gave herself wholly to him and to the tiny household they were building together. Each morning, she woke earlier than him, sweeping the room, fetching water, and cooking whatever little food they could afford. Sometimes, it was nothing more than Gary soaked in water. Other times, when fortune smiled, she prepared a thin soup and prayed it would be enough for both of them. She wore a smile even when her stomach growled with hunger. She wanted him to feel peace when he looked at her, even if inside, she battled uncertainty. But the man was distant. He did not return her sacrifices with affection. There were no long embraces, no tender words to reassure her that she had not given up her life for nothing. He was a man hardened by poverty, his heart too consumed with survival to notice the love waiting for him in her eyes. Still, she did not complain. She believed love was not measured by words alone but by patience. She held on to small moments, like the evenings when he would sit quietly beside her, their silence filled with unspoken promises, or the rare mornings when he would ask if she had eaten. To her, those were signs that he cared, even if he did not know how to show it. The rains came, and with them, the familiar battle of the leaking roof and rising floodwaters. She learned to live with it, to fold her clothes neatly in plastic bags, to lift her small box of belongings off the wet floor whenever the clouds darkened. When he slept through the storm, she would rise with a rag in hand, cleaning the water that seeped in, whispering to herself that one day, they would have a better home. At night, when he turned away on the bed, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart aching with questions she never voiced. Does he love me? Did I make a mistake? Will things ever get better? Yet, with every dawn, she chose hope over doubt. For her, this was not just a beginning. It was a test of endurance, of love, and of faith in a man she believed destiny had given her. She was certain that tomorrow would reward her sacrifices. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring more pain than she had ever imagined. For months, life remained the same. Small meals, sleepless nights during heavy rains, and a man too consumed with hardship to notice the woman who gave everything for him. But then, as though fate had finally decided to smile on him, an opportunity came. It was not wealth, not a business empire, but it was a job, a steady one. He was hired to deliver letters and documents across town. The pay was modest, yet in Bundu, even modest pay could change everything. For the first time in years, he had a regular income. He came home with small wads of money, enough to buy better food, enough to replace the ragged slippers he had worn for too long, enough to taste what stability felt like. The woman rejoiced. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not for herself, but for him. She believed this was the turning point. She imagined he would see her sacrifices, remember the nights she stayed awake to keep their little room from flooding, recall how she gave up her tailoring just to stand by him. She thought he would finally smile at her with tenderness, maybe even take her hand and say, "You've been my blessing." But instead, the opposite happened. The more money he made, the colder he became. Where once he had been distant, now he was cruel. He no longer came home with excitement, no longer looked at her with even the smallest sign of affection. His money went into clothes for himself, drinks with friends, and eventually, into the arms of other women. At first, she told herself it was just a phase. She excused his late nights, the way he avoided her eyes, the silence that grew between them. But then the truth became undeniable. He was changing, and the change was not in her favor. And yet, she endured. She endured when he stopped giving her money for food. She endured when she had to sell tiny things in the market just to eat. She endured even when she realized she was pregnant. Her pregnancy should have been a time of joy, a time of anticipation, a time when a man draws closer to the woman carrying his child. But for her, it was a lonely journey. He gave her nothing, not new clothes, not food to strengthen her body, not comfort when the nights grew long and painful. She wore rags, stitched over and over again, her belly swelling beneath them, her spirit breaking a little more each day. The house that was once bearable became a prison. When it rained, water still poured through the roof, rising from the ground until it felt like the room itself was drowning. She would wake in the middle of the night, her child still in her womb, cleaning the floor so that the flood would not swallow them. Meanwhile, he would lie on the bed, indifferent, sometimes even annoyed that her movements disturbed his sleep. On the day she gave birth, he was not there. He did not hold her hand, did not hear her cries, did not see the child who was half of him enter the world. She went through labor alone, clutching her pain, whispering prayers, hoping that at least the child would be a reason for him to soften. But when she returned home with the baby in her arms, her hope quickly shattered. He did not rejoice. He did not even care. Instead, he grew more distant, more hostile, more unrecognizable. The child, her tiny miracle, became her only comfort. But even as she cradled her baby, she could not stop the tears that came at night, tears for the man who had promised nothing yet still found a way to betray her. What she did not know was that her suffering was only beginning. Motherhood is supposed to be a time of joy. It is supposed to be a season where a woman, despite her struggles, finds comfort in the tender arms of the man she loves, and together they dream about the child they've brought into the world. But for her, motherhood was another name for loneliness. The day she returned home with her newborn, she hoped, just once, that he would surprise her. She thought maybe he would smile at the baby, touch the tiny fingers curled into fists, or at least ask how she was feeling after the pain of childbirth. But when he entered the room that evening, he barely looked at them. He climbed into bed, turned his back, and slept, leaving her standing by the wooden chair, her child crying softly in her arms. She whispered to herself, "At least I have you," and she pressed her baby close to her chest, rocking him gently, her tears falling silently on his soft skin. Her life became a cycle of endless sacrifice. By day, she walked the streets of Bundu with her baby tied to her back, selling little things in the market, vegetables, roasted corn, anything she could find. The sun burned her skin, the weight of the child strained her back, yet she pushed on because there was no one else to provide. She returned home each night with coins so small they could hardly buy kerosene or Gary. Still, she thanked God for the little she had, for it kept her and her child alive. By night, her suffering deepened. When the clouds opened and the rains came, their home became a battlefield once again. Water poured in through the leaking roof, and the muddy ground turned to streams that swallowed the floor. With her baby tied to her back, she would rise in the middle of the night, cloth in hand, bending low, cleaning, squeezing, mopping, anything to keep the flood from drowning them. Her child often whimpered in the dark, his cries mixing with the sound of rain beating mercilessly on the roof. He, the father, the man who should have been her protector, never lifted a finger. He would lie on the bed, shifting impatiently when she disturbed his rest, his face etched with irritation rather than pity. To him, her efforts meant nothing. To him, her tears were weakness. And yet, she endured. Her body grew thin from malnutrition. Her eyes, once full of quiet beauty, now carried dark shadows of exhaustion. Her clothes hung loosely around her, ragged and torn, stitched and restitched until they could hold no more thread. But her heart, the heart of a mother, remained strong. She held her child close, kissed him when no one was watching, and whispered promises into his tiny ears. "You will not suffer like me. You will not remain in this place. God will raise you up, my son. You will make me proud." But as months turned into years, and her child began to grow, the man who should have been her partner only grew colder. He began to despise her more openly, snapping at her, ignoring her needs, treating her like a stranger in the very home she struggled to keep together. And then, barely 2 years after the first child, she discovered she was pregnant again. Instead of joy, instead of relief that his family was growing, his response was rage. He struck her, beat her even with her swollen belly, shouting words that cut deeper than the blows. "Abort it. I don't want another child. I don't want you." But she carried the child anyway, her tears watering the soil of her suffering, her prayers rising like smoke in the night. For her children, she endured. For love, she endured. For hope that one day, God would turn her pain into laughter, she endured. Little did she know, her endurance would soon lead her down an even lonelier road, one where he would send her away, and her only refuge would be the arms of his mother. Pregnancy, for most women, is a season of tenderness, a time when a husband hovers close, ensuring that his wife eats enough, rests well, and smiles often. But for her, pregnancy was a season of torment. When she told him she was expecting their second child, his face darkened, his eyes filled not with pride but with hatred. "I don't want it," he spat at her. "Abort it. I said I don't want you pregnant again." She stood in silence, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach, shielding the innocent life growing inside her. Abortion was never an option in her heart. To her, every child was a gift, even if their father rejected them. She turned away, tears burning her cheeks, praying silently for strength. But the man's rage did not end with words. Many nights, he raised his hands against her swollen belly, his anger falling on her body in cruel blows. She cried out, begged him to stop, pleaded that she was carrying his blood, his child. But his heart had grown too hardened to listen. He treated her as though her existence was a burden, as though the very sight of her and her pregnancy was an insult to him. She endured, because what choice did she have? Each time his fists landed, each time his harsh words cut her soul, she whispered to her unborn child, "Hold on, my baby. Hold on. I will not let you go. God will keep you safe." But one night, after another bitter argument, he made his decision. "Leave my house," he shouted, his voice like thunder. "I don't want to see you here again. Go, before I do something you will regret." Her knees weakened beneath her. With a child in her arms and another in her womb, she gathered the few belongings she owned, worn clothes folded neatly into a small bag, a piece of cloth to tie her baby on her back. She looked around the room, the place where she had given everything, the place she had once dreamed would be their home. And she wept. But even in that moment of rejection, God did not abandon her. With nowhere else to go, she turned to the one person she never expected would accept her, his mother. When she arrived at the older woman's home, dusty and exhausted, she could barely speak. She only stood there, her child on her back, her stomach heavy with another, her face streaked with tears. His mother looked at her, really looked at her, and something in her heart softened. She opened her arms and said the words that felt like healing balm to the broken woman. "My daughter, don't cry. Come in. You are safe here." For the first time in a long while, she felt embraced, not rejected. She felt seen, not despised. She was given a mat to rest on, food to eat, and words of comfort her husband had never spoken to her. The months passed, and though she still carried the pain of his rejection, she found a measure of peace in the small village house of his mother. The older woman cared for her, ensured she ate, and even helped her through the pains of childbirth when her second baby came into the world. It should have been a time of healing. Yet even in this refuge, she could not fully escape the shadow of her suffering. For in her dreams, strange visions began to haunt her, visions that would soon reveal a truth too heavy to ignore. Life in the small village house was far from easy, but compared to what she had endured in Bundu, it felt like a shelter of peace. His mother treated her kindly, as though making up for the cruelty her son had shown. She had food to eat, a safe roof over her head, and the warmth of a woman who understood what it meant to suffer. For 6 long months, she stayed there, nursing her pain and caring for her first child while her second grew inside her. He, the man who had cast her out, never came to visit. Not once did he ask how she was. Not once did he send word. Not even when his second child was born. To him, she did not exist. To him, the children were invisible. And yet, her heart could not completely let go. She had loved him, given everything for him, and though he broke her spirit daily, some part of her still longed for the man she once believed he could be. One night, as she lay on the mat with her children beside her, she drifted into a sleep unlike any she had known before. The night was heavy and silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, and in her dream, she found herself standing in a vast, empty field. The sky above her was dark, yet a strange light glowed on the horizon. From the shadows, a voice came. It was neither male nor female, but it carried a weight that shook her soul. "Daughter," the voice said, echoing in the emptiness. "You must not leave him. If you do, he will die." She froze, her hands trembling at her sides. "Die?" she thought. "But he hates me. He has rejected me. He has made my life nothing but sorrow. Why should I stay?" As though hearing her thoughts, the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You are his covering. You are the reason he lives. Do not walk away, for if you do, his end will come swiftly." She fell to her knees in the dream, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream, to protest, to say that she too deserved love, peace, and kindness. She wanted to ask why her life had to be tied to a man who treated her worse than a stranger. But before she could speak, the voice faded, and the field dissolved into darkness. She awoke with a start, her body trembling, her clothes soaked with sweat. The dream felt too real to ignore. She sat in silence, staring at her sleeping children, her heart torn in two. Part of her wanted to stay in the safety of the village, in the arms of the woman who cared for her. But another part, the part that still carried love, or maybe pity, for the man who had ruined her, could not shake the warning. The next morning, she told his mother about the dream. The old woman listened quietly, her face thoughtful. Then she sighed deeply. "My daughter," she said softly, "sometimes God speaks to us in ways we do not understand. If he has told you not to leave my son, then perhaps your destiny is tied to his. Go back. Endure. One day, you will understand why." It was the last thing she wanted to hear. Every part of her body resisted the idea of returning to Bundu, to the leaking roof, to the man who treated her with hatred. But her heart was tender, her faith unshaken, and her dream too heavy to ignore. And so, with tears in her eyes, she gathered her children, tied the youngest to her back, and set out once more. She left the comfort of the village, the kindness of his mother, and walked back into the darkness of Bundu, back into the arms of a man who despised her. Because in her heart, she believed that keeping him alive was her burden to bear. The path back to Bundu felt longer than the journey out. Each step weighed heavily on her spirit, but she walked on, carrying her children and the burden of the dream that tied her fate to his. By the time she reached the small, broken house, dusk had fallen, and the neighborhood was quiet. When he opened the door and saw her standing there, his face twisted with anger. "So you came back?" he said coldly, his eyes narrowing. "Who told you to return?" She lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. "I had a dream. I was told not to leave you." He scoffed, turning away. "Dreams," he muttered. "Nonsense. Stay if you want, but don't expect anything from me." And so she entered once more, stepping back into the prison of his cruelty. The endless struggle. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and life became a cycle of pain. He did not change. If anything, his hatred grew stronger, his rejection sharper. He denied her food, withheld money, and treated her as though she were invisible. When she spoke, he silenced her. When she asked for help, he mocked her. When she pleaded for love, he gave her nothing but silence and scorn. She worked tirelessly, doing menial jobs, fetching water, washing clothes for neighbors, anything to feed her children. Many nights, she went to bed hungry so that they could eat. Her hands grew rough, her body frail, but her spirit refused to break. Her children watched her suffer, and even in their innocence, they felt the weight of her pain. The oldest began asking questions. "Mama, why does Papa hate you? Why does he not smile at us?" She forced a smile, hiding her tears. "Don't say that, my child. Your father loves you in his own way." But deep inside, she knew her words were lies meant to shield their tender hearts. Shackled by love, her dream haunted her still. Each time she thought of leaving, the words returned, "If you do, he will die." And so she stayed, shackled not by chains of iron, but by chains of love, pity, and fear. Love, because she could not stop caring, even for the man who despised her. Pity, because she saw how empty he truly was. Fear, because she believed his life rested in her hands. Every day became a battle of endurance. She prayed, cried, and whispered to God for strength. Sometimes, she wondered if death might be kinder than the life she lived. But then she would look at her children, their innocent faces, their fragile smiles, and she would gather her strength again. The children's burden. As the years passed, the children began to share in her suffering. Poverty clung to them like a second skin. They wore torn clothes, often went without shoes, and ate only when she could find work. Yet even in their hardship, they clung to her. She was their rock, their comfort, their hope. They saw her sacrifices, her sleepless nights, her whispered prayers, and they loved her fiercely. The man they called father remained distant, harsh, and cold. He had no time for them, no affection to give. He lived as though they did not exist. And in their little hearts, they began to understand that their mother's love was the only true shelter they had. Shackled by love, bound by duty, and strengthened only by faith, she carried her cross with a grace few could understand. To the world, she was just another woman in Bundu, but within her lived a story of survival, sacrifice, and unbroken spirit. And though she did not yet know it, the years ahead would test her even more, until her suffering would become the seed of a testimony too powerful to be silenced. The years rolled by in Bundu, but instead of healing, life only grew harsher. The man she called her husband remained a stranger in his own home, aloof, bitter, and unyielding. His heart was stone, his words daggers, and his silence heavier than chains. For her, every sunrise was a reminder of the battles waiting ahead. The hunger, the lack, the rejection, and the endless struggle to keep her children alive. Poverty's sharp bite. The little house became a prison of need. The roof leaked whenever it rained, flooding the floor and soaking their thin mats. The walls cracked, the windows broke, and the air smelled of dampness and despair. Food was never enough. Most days, she boiled plain gari into a watery paste, giving most of it to the children while she swallowed her hunger. Meat was a luxury they could not dream of. Even salt, at times, was too costly. Her children grew thin, their eyes wide with questions they could not ask. They wore clothes patched over and over, until the fabric itself gave way. Shoes were rare, and when they walked to school, dust and thorns pricked their feet. Yet, despite it all, she forced herself to smile at them, to sing songs at night, to tell stories that lifted their spirits. She wanted them to believe that joy was still possible, even in the storm. His growing cruelty, instead of pitying her struggles, he grew crueler. He mocked her tears, laughed at her efforts, and denied her even the smallest kindness. When she asked for food money, he turned away. When she spoke of the children's needs, he silenced her with sharp words. Neighbors saw, but few intervened. Some pitied her, others whispered about her weakness. Why does she stay? They asked among themselves. Why doesn't she leave him? But they did not know of the dream that chained her, the warning that echoed in her soul. If you leave him, he will die. And so she endured. Her health begins to fail. Years of hardship wore her down. Her body, once strong, became frail. She grew pale and thin, her eyes hollow but still burning with quiet strength. Illness came often, malaria, fever, exhaustion from endless labor. Yet she never stopped. Even when her chest ached and her legs shook beneath her, she carried on. She washed clothes by the riverside, fetched heavy buckets of water, and worked for pennies to feed her children. Many nights, she coughed until dawn, her body weak, but she never let her children see her despair. When they asked if she was all right, she forced a smile. "Mama is strong," she told them. "Don't worry." But inside, she feared she was breaking. Faith in the fire. In the depths of her suffering, she clung to her faith. Every night, when all were asleep, she knelt on the cold floor and prayed. Her whispers rose into the darkness. "Lord, do not let me fail. Give me strength for my children. Keep him alive, if that is your will. Let this suffering not be in vain." Her prayers were not grand, but they were steady, constant, filled with tears and hope. And though life did not ease, there was something unshakable in her spirit. Her faith became the anchor that held her when everything else was falling apart. The storm deepened, yes, but so too did her resilience. And though her body weakened, her spirit stood taller than the cruelty surrounding her. Little did she know, every tear she shed was watering the seed of a testimony that would one day shine brighter than all the pain she had endured. Darkness had stretched over the years like a heavy cloak, yet even in Bundu, light sometimes slipped through the cracks. For her, hope never came as loud miracles, but in small, tender moments that reminded her she was not forgotten. The children's spark. Her children, though frail and often hungry, became her greatest source of strength. They were her companions in sorrow and her reason to keep breathing. One evening, as she sat outside, exhausted from washing clothes for neighbors, her eldest child came to her with a folded piece of paper. It was a school report. His grades were excellent, despite all the hardship, despite walking to school barefoot, despite often studying by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. "Mama," he said shyly, "I want to make you proud." Tears welled in her eyes. She hugged him tightly, her heart swelling with joy. In that moment, she realized that her sacrifices were not in vain. Her children were her legacy, her proof that love could grow even in barren soil. The kindness of strangers. One afternoon, while she was washing clothes by the river, an elderly woman approached. The woman had often watched her from a distance, admiring her perseverance. "My daughter," the woman said gently, "I see how you struggle. You are strong, but strength also needs rest. Take this." She handed her a small bag of rice and some money, enough to feed the children for several days. Overwhelmed, she fell to her knees in gratitude. It was not much, but to her, it was everything. It was proof that God still remembered her, that kindness still existed in the world. A flicker of joy. That night, for the first time in months, the little house was filled with laughter. The children ate until their bellies were full, their faces glowing with smiles. She watched them and felt a warmth inside her chest. Though her husband remained cold and distant, though poverty still clung to them, there was a small flame burning inside her now. Hope, strength in faith. Her prayers changed, too. Instead of only asking God for survival, she began to thank Him for the little victories. "Thank you, Lord, for food today. Thank you for my children's strength. Thank you for the stranger's kindness. I may be broken, but I am not abandoned." And as she prayed, her spirit felt lighter. She began to see her suffering not only as a burden, but as a journey that somehow, beyond the pain, there was a purpose waiting to be revealed. The storm had not ended, but for the first time, she saw a glimpse of dawn. A fragile dawn, yes, but enough to whisper to her weary soul, "Hold on. You are not forgotten. One day, this story will change." Hope had flickered, yes, but the storm had not fully passed. Life in Bundu still pressed her down, and soon, the weight became too much for her fragile body to bear. The collapse. One sweltering afternoon, she was returning from the riverside, balancing a heavy bucket of water on her head. The children walked behind her, their small feet dragging in the dust. Her chest had been aching for days, her body weak from hunger and overwork, but she had forced herself to keep going. Suddenly, the world around her blurred. Her legs gave way. The bucket slipped from her head, spilling water into the sand. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Her children screamed her name, shaking her, crying, "Mama, Mama, please wake up." Neighbors rushed out, carrying her inside. Her body was burning with fever, her breathing shallow, her skin clammy. It seemed as though death itself was knocking. His indifference. Her husband stood over her, frowning. There was no fear in his eyes, no tenderness, only irritation. "She is weak because she worries too much," he muttered. "She will recover." But the neighbors saw it differently. They shook their heads in pity. Some whispered, "This woman has suffered too much. If care is not taken, she may not survive this." Yet he did nothing. Not a coin for medicine, not a gesture of comfort. Between life and death, for days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she saw her children's faces, wet with tears. Sometimes, she felt herself floating in darkness, her spirit longing to rest. In the stillness of one night, she whispered a prayer, her voice barely audible. "Lord, if my time has come, take care of my children. But if there is still purpose for me, give me strength to rise again." Her words melted into the silence. A child's prayer. Her youngest child knelt beside her mat, clasping tiny hands together. With a trembling voice, the child prayed, "God, please don't take Mama away. We need her. We can't live without her. Please, make her strong again." It was the simplest of prayers, but in heaven, it was loud enough to move mountains. The turning point. By the next morning, her fever began to break. Slowly, her breathing steadied. Strength crept back into her body, little by little. The neighbors who had feared the worst now shook their heads in wonder. "This woman is a miracle," they said. She had brushed the edge of death, but life had pulled her back. A new resolve. When she finally opened her eyes and saw her children gathered around her, relief washed over her. Their faces were streaked with tears, but their eyes glowed with love. In that moment, she made a vow in her heart. "I will not let this suffering destroy me. If I live for my children. If I fight for them. No matter how heavy the storm grows, I will endure." The breaking point had come, but instead of shattering her, it reshaped her. She was no longer just a wife enduring pain. She was a mother reborn with fire in her soul. The storm had almost claimed her, but from the ashes of weakness, she rose again, stronger, fiercer, and more determined to survive than ever before. Her body was still weak, but her spirit had been awakened. She now understood something powerful. Though life had pressed her down, her children were not just burdens. They were her partners in survival. And slowly, the little ones began to rise. Small shoulders, heavy loads. Her eldest son started helping more than before. At dawn, before school, he would fetch water, sweep the compound, and even run errands for neighbors to earn a few coins. Sometimes, he returned with bread or gari. He would place it in her hands and whisper, "Mama, eat first." She always shook her head, pushing the food back to him. But deep inside, her heart swelled with pride. He was only a child, yet already carrying the weight of a man. The girl who learned to mend. Her daughter, though still young, watched carefully whenever women in the community sewed or patched clothes. One afternoon, with a small needle given by a kind neighbor, she sat outside, mending her mother's torn wrapper. The stitches were crooked, but her mother wore it with pride. "Mama," the girl said softly, "one day I will sew better clothes for you. You will not suffer like this forever." Her mother smiled weakly, tears burning her eyes. "My daughter, you are already a blessing." Unity in hunger. Even the youngest ones contributed in their own little ways. They learned not to cry when food was scarce. Instead, they distracted each other with laughter, singing playful songs, turning sorrow into moments of light. The neighbors sometimes shook their heads in amazement. "These children are different," they said. "Despite the suffering, see how united they are." A silent teacher. What the children didn't realize was that their mother had become their greatest teacher. Not through lessons written on paper, but through her endurance, her love, and her prayers. Her silent resilience became their guiding light. Watching her survive each day taught them that strength was not the absence of pain, but the decision to rise despite it. a mother's pride. One evening, she sat under the fading sunset. Her children gathered around her. They laughed, shared stories, and for a moment, it felt as if the burdens of life had lifted. She looked at their faces, glowing in the golden light, and her heart whispered, "I may not have silver or gold to give you, but I have taught you how to endure, how to love, and how to rise. That is my legacy." And for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir deep inside her. Not just survival, but a quiet pride. Her children were no longer just surviving with her. They were rising beside her. The fire had not yet consumed them. Against all odds, they were learning to shine. Strength is not the absence of pain. It is often the mask worn to hide it. Though she smiled for her children, though she rose from her sickbed and pushed forward, deep inside, she was still bleeding. The nights of tears. By day, she was their pillar. By night, when her children were asleep, she allowed her heart to break. Alone in the darkness, she muffled her sobs so they wouldn't hear. She cried for the life she once dreamed of, for the love that had turned into cruelty, for the loneliness that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Sometimes, she pressed her face into her pillow and whispered, "Lord, how much longer? Must I carry this cross forever?" His shadow in her heart. Her husband was still there, present in body, absent in soul. He came and went as he pleased, often returning drunk, careless with his words, careless with her heart. Every insult cut her deeper than a knife, but she never answered back. She swallowed the bitterness, choosing silence over war. Her children never knew the full extent of her pain. She hid it from them, for she did not want their love for their father to die. The loneliness that echoed. She envied the other women in the community, those who had husbands who brought home food, who laughed with them, who held them at night, not because she desired luxury, but because she longed for companionship, a simple hand to hold, a voice to say, "You are not alone." But all she had was silence, and the cold presence of a man who saw her suffering yet chose not to care. The strength she couldn't show. Her children believed she was unbreakable. They looked at her with eyes full of admiration. But if only they knew the truth, that some days she wanted to give up, that some nights she wished she could run far away and never return. Yet, every morning, she rose again, covering her wounds with a fragile smile. For them, always for them, a silent prayer. One evening, as she watched her children play in the dust, laughter echoing into the twilight, she whispered softly to herself, "If this is the life I must live, then give me the strength to endure it. But if there is a way, Lord, open a door for us. I do not ask for riches, only peace." Her tears fell silently, but her children never saw, because her battle was not for the world to witness. It was a silent war, fought within her soul, every single day. Though she was breaking inside, her silence was not weakness. It was sacrifice. It was love. It was the invisible strength that kept her children's world from falling apart. Darkness had become her closest companion, but even the longest nights end with a glimmer of dawn. One afternoon, that dawn came, not in riches or miracles, but in a simple act of kindness that touched her weary soul. The unexpected visitor. It was market day. She had no money, but she walked through the stalls anyway, pretending to price food. Her children followed closely, their eyes glued to roasted corn, akara, and fresh vegetables. A kind-hearted woman selling Gary noticed her. The vendor had watched her for months, thin, tired, with children who always looked hungry. That day, the woman called out softly, "Sister, come." At first, she hesitated, ashamed, but the woman smiled warmly and poured a small measure of Gary into a nylon bag. "Take it. For the children. Don't worry about paying." Tears stung her eyes as she whispered, "God bless you." Bread at the door. On another day, a neighbor quietly left half a loaf of bread by her doorstep. No name, no words, just bread wrapped in brown paper. When her children found it, they cheered as if it were a feast. She stood back, hand on her chest, whispering thanks to whoever had thought of them. She realized then that though the world was harsh, it still had hearts that cared. The weight of a smile. It wasn't always food. Sometimes, it was just a smile from another mother. Sometimes, a passerby asking, "How are you holding up?" Those small moments were lifelines. They reminded her she wasn't completely invisible. They reminded her that kindness still existed, even if rare, even if fleeting. The children's joy. Her children, too, noticed these gestures. One day, after eating roasted yam given freely by a kind trader, her eldest son whispered, "Mama, not everyone is like Papa. Some people are good." She nodded slowly, stroking his hair. "Yes, my son, and you must learn from them. Never let this world make your heart hard." A flicker of hope. That night, lying in the darkness, she thought of the woman in the market, the bread at her door, the kind smiles along the way. For the first time in a long while, her heart felt a flicker of hope. She understood something precious. Even in suffering, God sometimes sends angels, not with wings, but with ordinary hands. And sometimes, all it takes to keep a soul alive is a single, quiet act of kindness. Though her life was still filled with hardship, that little ray of kindness reminded her, the world was not entirely cruel. A man may run wild for years, but sooner or later, life catches up. The strength he once boasted of, the pride he carried like a crown, began to crumble. The signs of wear. At first, it was small. He no longer returned home with the same loud laughter that once filled the compound. His friends, who used to drink and sing with him, began to drift away. The bottles became heavier, his steps grew weaker, and slowly, his body started to betray him. The children's eyes. His children saw it before he did. They noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he tried to lift a bottle, how his cough lingered longer than before. But they said nothing, for in their eyes, he had never been a source of comfort, only a shadow of pain. They pitied him, but from a distance. The world turns away. The neighbors, once entertained by his wild stories, now shook their heads when they saw him stumble past. Employers who had once trusted him stopped offering work. His reputation, once loud and feared, was now tarnished with whispers. He has wasted himself. One by one, the doors of opportunity closed. The mirror he couldn't face. At night, when the alcohol wore off, he sat alone in silence. His mind replayed the years, the wife he had wounded, the children he had neglected, the home he had abandoned in spirit. But pride is a heavy chain. Even in his decline, he could not bring himself to say, "I was wrong." Instead, he drank more, as if drowning could erase the truth. The mother's eyes. She watched him quietly, not with joy at his downfall, but with sorrow. For though he had hurt her deeply, she never wished him destruction. Sometimes, when no one was looking, she prayed silently for him. "Lord, touch his heart before it is too late." But even she knew, some lessons are learned only when a man is brought low. The beginning of regret. One evening, he returned home weaker than ever. His voice, once filled with pride, was soft and shaky. He looked at his children, now growing, now becoming stronger without him, and something inside him cracked. For the first time, regret began to gnaw at his heart. He realized too late that the life he had wasted could never be fully reclaimed. The decline had begun, and it would only deepen. Pain had been their foundation, hunger their companion, and shame their clothing. But seeds planted in tears often bloom in strength. Her children, though scarred by their father's neglect, carried inside them the lessons of resilience. The first breakthrough. It began with the eldest. He worked small jobs, carrying loads in the market, washing cars, selling sachet water in traffic. Every coin he earned, he brought home. At night, after the day's struggle, he would light a candle and read borrowed books. His mother, though tired, sat beside him, whispering encouragement. "Knowledge is power, my son. Don't give up." One day, a teacher noticed his brilliance and paid his school fees for a term. It was the first crack of light breaking into their dark world. A mother's fuel. The younger ones followed his example. They had seen hunger, yet they refused to be defeated by it. Each one carried in their hearts their mother's voice. "We may be poor, but you are not worthless. Hold your head high." Even in ragged clothes, they walked with dignity. Small victories. There were days when one of them came home with a prize from school, an exercise book, a pen, or sometimes just the honor of being called the best in class. The mother would gather them, smiling with tears in her eyes. "This is our wealth," she would say. "Not money, but wisdom." Her heart swelled with pride each time they chose books over bitterness. Beyond the father's shadow, the father, by now weakened and aging, could only watch as his children grew into strong young men and women. He saw in them a reflection of what he could have been, had he chosen differently. But they owed their strength not to him, but to the mother who carried them through fire and did not let them burn. A new chapter for them. As the years went on, opportunities opened. One child entered university through sheer determination. Another learned a trade and became skilled enough to earn respect. The children, once mocked as the hungry ones, were slowly becoming the pride of the community. The mother's reward. Every night, as she watched them sleep, no longer thin from hunger, but filled with hope, she whispered prayers of gratitude. Her reward was not riches. Her reward was seeing her children rise from ashes into strength. And though life had wounded her deeply, she smiled, for her suffering had not been in vain. From brokenness, she had raised warriors, and from tears, she had grown leaders. A man may wrong his wife, he may wound his children, but when the years strip him bare, and his strength is gone, only a mother can kneel for him when his own pride will not. The visit. It was a quiet afternoon when she came. An old woman, weary with age, yet her steps carried urgency. She walked slowly into the compound, her wrapper faded but her dignity intact. Her eyes, though dim with years, still held the weight of sorrow. The children greeted her with respect, for she was their grandmother. The wife bowed slightly, keeping her distance, for in her heart still lived the scars of yesterday. A mother's pain. She sat on the wooden bench, heaving a sigh. Her voice trembled as she began. "My daughter, my grandchildren, I know the pain my son has caused you. I know the nights you cried alone, the hunger you endured, the shame you carried because of him." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was not blind. I saw it, but I was powerless to stop him." The silence was heavy. Even the children lowered their eyes, for the wound was still fresh. The plea. The old woman's voice broke as she continued. "Now, look at him. His strength is gone, his pride broken. He is not the man he once was. I beg you, do not let him die carrying the burden of your hatred. Forgive him, for me." Her wrinkled hands trembled as she clasped the wife's hands. "You have been more than a wife, you have been mother and father to these children. Please, let your mercy be greater than his cruelty." The struggle within. The wife's heart battled within her. Memories rose, nights of hunger, insults thrown at her, the helpless cries of her children. Why should she forgive? Why should the man who destroyed their peace be granted mercy he never asked for? Yet as she looked at the frail old woman kneeling before her, her heart softened. This was not about the man anymore. This was about a mother's cry, the children's decision. The children, too, spoke quietly among themselves. One said, "He never treated us like his own." Another whispered, "But she is our grandmother. How can we refuse her?" Finally, the eldest spoke, "If we forgive, it is not because he deserves it, but because we will not let bitterness chain us. We will forgive for her." The answer. The wife lifted the old woman gently and embraced her. Tears rolled down both their cheeks. "Mama," she said softly, "for your sake, I will forgive. Not because he earned it, but because mercy is greater than anger." The old woman wept openly, her heart relieved. It was settled. Forgiveness was given, not because of the man's repentance, but because of a mother's plea and the strength of a woman's heart. Time is a mirror. It reflects not only youth and strength, but also the consequences of the paths we walk. The man who once strutted with arrogance, who wasted his days in drink and reckless living, was now only a shadow of himself. The fading of strength. His once broad shoulders had bent. The voice that barked in anger was now weak and trembling. The eyes that once looked with pride now stared with regret. His friends, those who drank with him, laughed with him, and pushed him into deeper ruin, were gone. Some had died, others vanished into their own misfortunes. Now he sat often alone, with only silence to keep him company. The weight of emptiness. Though his wife and children had chosen forgiveness, their hearts did not forget. They respected him, but there was a distance he could not bridge. He was in the same house, yet not part of their joy. He watched them laugh, succeed, and grow, but he was an outsider looking in. The children brought gifts for their mother, celebrated her sacrifices, and honored her with every achievement. For him, there was no such honor. His mother's comfort. The only person who still sat beside him with compassion was his aged mother. She reminded him daily, "Life is a wheel, my son. What you give is what returns to you." He nodded silently, for he knew the truth of her words too well. Nights of reflection. In the quiet of the night, when everyone was asleep, he would whisper into the darkness, "If only I had loved them. If only I had listened. If only I had built, instead of destroyed." The word, "if," became his only companion. The wife's heart. The wife, though scarred, cared for him in his weakness, not as a lover, but as a fellow human being. She cooked his meals, gave him his medicine, and ensured he was not abandoned. But in her heart, she had long since detached from the bond of marriage. She was no longer his partner. She was his caretaker. A quiet end approaches. Years slipped by, and the man realized that his wealth of youth had been squandered. He had nothing to leave behind but memories of pain. His children grew strong, his wife stood radiant in dignity, and he, once the head of the home, was the frailest among them. In the silence of his fading years, he finally understood. Love, if neglected, becomes a stranger. Family, if mistreated, becomes a wound. And life, if wasted, becomes an empty shell. The final chapter of his life had begun, not written with joy, but with regret. Every story has an end, but not every end is triumphant. Some are heavy with lessons, written not in glory, but in the quiet weight of regret. The final days, the man's health declined. His once fiery voice was reduced to whispers. The man who once cursed and commanded could now barely call a name. His children visited often, not with hatred, but with polite distance. They would greet him, bow respectfully, and then turn their affection to their mother. He watched from his chair as life moved on without him. The woman's victory. The wife, now older, stood strong like a tree that had survived countless storms. Her children called her blessed. Neighbors respected her. Even strangers admired her resilience. Though she had walked through fire, she had come out refined, not consumed. Her sacrifices bore fruit, her children successful, her name honored. The mother's last words. One quiet evening, his aged mother, frailier than ever, sat by his side. Her voice was gentle, almost fading. "My son, this is the life you chose. But take comfort that forgiveness found you before the end. Learn from your pain, even if the years are few." He nodded weakly, a tear sliding down his cheek. For once, he had no words. His final realization. In the silence of his last days, he whispered often to himself, "If only love had guided me. If only I had cherished them when I had the chance." But the world does not rewind. Time does not return. And apologies spoken at the end rarely heal the wounds of the past. The end of his journey. One night, as the house lay in deep sleep, he took his final breath. No cries of anguish filled the air, only a quiet stillness. The wife sighed deeply, not in bitterness, but in reflection. The children bowed their heads, not in grief, but in solemn respect. He had gone, leaving behind not wealth, not honor, but a story heavy with lessons. The legacy of pain and strength. His legacy was not in riches, but in the warning his life became. The children vowed never to repeat his mistakes. The wife became a symbol of resilience, a woman who bore pain but transformed it into strength. And the story of his life became a mirror for others. To love when love is needed, to protect when protection is required, to honor family before regret becomes the only companion. The closing lines. Thus ended the life of a man who had every chance to build, but chose instead to destroy. And thus began the testimony of a woman who carried pain, but rose above it with grace. For in the end, it was not his voice that spoke the loudest. It was hers. Her silence, her endurance, her dignity. These became the true legacy.